Very, very pleased today to have our great friend, Dr. Ammie Kalan, presenting to us about her work with the Pan-African Project. Ammie is a fantastic researcher. I checked her CV and I was reminded that her first publication was on clapping behavior in gorillas, which we don't talk about often enough, but we should. And it should have stopped there, but she just kept going with more and more exciting projects. And she did her PhD on food cults in chimpanzees in the Thai national parks, and at the same time trying to develop methods to use recordings and long-term recordings to identify chimpanzee sounds in the forest. And she has since then moved on to culture and behavioral diversity in the Pan-African Project, which she will talk about more today. And I'm very happy to announce, and I think I might be the first one, that Ammie has accepted a new position at the University of Victoria in Canada to start next year as an assistant professor. So a great loss for European primatology, but fantastic for Ammie. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Ammie Kalan, and have fun, everyone.
Thanks, Alex, for that very sweet and generous introduction. It's my pleasure to be invited by this group to give this last seminar, if I understand it. That's going to end your Primate Conversation seminar series for the summer, or kick off the summer. So I hope I can keep you entertained for the next 30 or so minutes, and that you'll hopefully learn something new. So as Alex mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the Pan-African perspective of studying chimpanzee behavioral diversity across their range. So all the work, or at least primarily most of the work that I'm going to discuss today, comes from the Pan-African program, the Cultured Chimpanzee, or for short, we just call it the PanAf. It was the first project sort of its kind, and it was launched back in 2010. With the essential aim to use standardized systematic data collected on wild chimpanzee populations that were scattered throughout their range. And the hope was that we would be able to get a better understanding of the true nature of the variation present in this species. And of course, one of the main motivations behind the project was actually to provide a better understanding of ecological and evolutionary drivers for cultural and behavioral diversity. So the PanAf team today is a lot smaller than when it first kicked off. And that's because the last PanAf research site closed last year in 2019. It's represented today by the co-directors, which are Mimi Arangelovic, Yalmar Kuhl, and Christoph Busch. And these are some of my colleagues, other postdocs and PhDs, as well as data managers, who are mostly based primarily out of Leipzig. And we all work on different aspects of the PanAf dataset. Now here's a map of some of the PanAf, actually all the PanAf temporary research sites. We call them temporary research sites because they only lasted in the field for about 1 year to a maximum of 2 years. And what you'll see here is, other than the chimpanzee range, which is illustrated, the different colors illustrate different subspecies. You'll also see the PanAf sites, which are the big green dots. And the big green dots represent the 39 or so sites where we have a complete full data set of field data from those sites. And this includes things like, actually, I'm going to go over it in the next slide, so I don't need to say that yet. And then the smaller green dots represent sites where we had usually a partial data set. So this would be sites where we only had perhaps organic samples or video data, for example. You'll also notice the X's, the red X's, just to show you that obviously sometimes things didn't go as planned. So there were places we tried to go and set up a research site, but sometimes due to political reasons, or because after conducting reconnaissance surveys, we found very few chimpanzee signs, we didn't actually establish a site in those sites, at those places. And the thing that I want to point out here is that all the PanAf temporary research sites were located in areas where the chimpanzees were wild and unhabituated to human observers at that time. So this basically means that we couldn't observe them directly in the field, and we had to use other methods to collect observations. And I'm going to speak about those methods in a few slides. So this is just to give it kind of a general overview of the approach we use for the PanAf for how we collected and targeted our field data collection. So essentially with the PanAf, the analytical approach is that everything is based on what you collect in the field. So the field data becomes the basis for collecting information about the genetic and microbial structure of a chimpanzee community, the resources available within the area of a chimpanzee territory, the demography and social demographics of a chimpanzee community, as well as their behavior. And then much of our energy and resources goes into processing that field data and validating it to make sure that we have comparative data sets across all the PanAf sites. We also make use of freely available data sets like GIS layers so that we can investigate large-scale models in order to better understand the patterns we observe in the field. This is to give you another bit of information into how we collected the field data. Actually, all the protocols that we used in the field for all the different types of data that we collected is actually available freely online in both English and French. So if you feel inclined or you would like to know more about those specific methods, you can find them at that website that's listed there. And essentially the basis for all the field data collection was using this sort of grid cell approach. So in this figure of one of our TRSs, you can see the white squares, which actually represent 1 by 1 kilometer grids. And this grid cell would sort of cover an area that ranged from sometimes 12 kilometers squared to over 140 kilometers squared. And that variation in size was really depending on the habitat and the topography of the landscape. So for example, we know that savanna woodland chimpanzees have larger territories than forest living chimpanzees. And so this is why we had some sites with over 100 kilometers squared area covered. And as I mentioned, the chimpanzees were unhabituated at all our sites. So in order to collect observations, we relied on camera trap methods. So we used devices like this one here, which are remote infrared sensor devices. Basically, it means that the infrared sensor detects movement in front of the lens, and that triggers it to record. And for all of our purposes, we had the device set to record 1 minute long videos. And we used a systematic approach where we had at least 1 camera trap per grid cell, as well as installing more camera traps opportunistically. So camera traps were generally installed in areas to increase detection of chimpanzees. So this would be places like tool use sites or feeding trees that we know chimpanzees like to eat from. Now, for any of you that have used camera traps in the audience, you'll know that if you use camera traps yourselves, you'll know that you get a lot of videos very quickly, and definitely all of them don't have chimpanzees in them. So when we first started our project, there was no automatic way to quickly identify which species was in which video. And so in 2015, we started a citizen science project called Chimpanzee. This was a PanAf collaboration with Zooniverse. And essentially here, we would upload our PanAf videos from all over our different sites and ask citizen scientists from all across the world to help us to annotate what they observe in the video. And there were about 29 different categories or sort of species or taxa that they could choose from what they observe in the video, as well as helping us to identify different behaviors. And there's a really detailed field guide, for example. Excuse me. And in that field guide, you can get more information about the different species that you might see in a video and the types of coloration or behaviors, for example, that they exhibit. And to date, the project's been running for over 4 years. There was a small break within 2018, 2019, where we had to actually revamp the site. And actually at the same time, we were able to allow the site to be now provided in multiple languages. So I think you can access it in Spanish, French, Italian, Czech, and German. And it's also, to date, we've had over 14,000 citizen scientists and over 4 million classifications. 16 of the PanAf field sites have been completely done. So all videos from those sites have been watched, and 2 are currently ongoing. And the most impressive thing to me is that to date, we've identified 462 unique chimpanzees from those sites. So this is not including chimpanzees that were just captured once, but these are chimpanzees that have been captured on multiple videos. And of course, this is a great initiative for public outreach and scientific outreach, but at the same time, Chimpanzee also provides us with really valuable data. So just to demonstrate that and also shamelessly plug one of my recent papers. Last year, I published a paper on the response of gray apes to the camera trap devices themselves, especially when they're encountering it for the very first time, because the camera trap sort of acts as a novel object in their environment. And the chimpanzee citizen scientists were actually instrumental in helping me to collect data that I used for this analysis. We're also working on automated approaches for the camera trap video data. In 2017, PanAf partnered with Driven Data to host a computer vision algorithm competition. And the machine learning, basically it was a machine learning algorithm competition. And what happened was that the winner won $20,000 and the winning algorithm, which was for automated species identification from camera trap videos in particular, became the basis for our open source Python program called Project Samba. The Samba is now hosted on a cloud-based interface that's hosted by Driven Data. So you can also access it here on that website at the bottom there, if you're interested. And this is just to give you an idea of what the output looks like. So for example, once you've uploaded all your videos and they've been processed by the algorithm, you get sort of a small screenshot of the video, which would be that gray square on the screen there, if your graphics card supports that. And then you would get for each class the probability that has been assigned to it. So for example, that very first video, it says it's actually a monkey video and it's been correctly assigned to other primate, which is our non-ape monkey class. And it's with over a 98% probability. But if you go to that second video, it's a hyena and it's pretty confused as to what to classify a hyena as. And that's probably because we didn't have very much hyena data in our PanAf data set. And so it's lacking basically from a good training model. At the moment, we're still improving the algorithm, hoping to actually improve its supervised learning technique, and as well as improving the interface in which individuals can use the program. So at the moment, the program is pretty difficult to use for the average user. So we're hoping to create an easy to use interface. All right, so that was my brief spiel about the PanAf and kind of giving you an overview of the project. And now what I'm going to do is present some studies that have been published recently. I'm going to talk about the discovery of new behaviors in the PanAf, cultural variation in chimpanzees, and threats and drivers of behavioral diversity in chimpanzees, mostly because those three topics are all topics that I've worked on during my postdoc with the PanAf. But of course, I'd like to also bring your attention to other topics that have recently been published on through the PanAf or are currently in progress. And that would be the camera trap methods validation studies, genetic diversity and connectivity of chimpanzees, sociodemographic variation, dietary analyses, and species habitat suitability models. So if some of these other topics also interest you, I'd encourage you to check out our website and keep up to date with some of the publications there. So the first thing I'm going to talk about today are some studies where we describe some new behaviors or behavioral variants that we discovered in the course of the PanAf. One of the first behaviors was algae fishing, which we discovered in Bakun, Guinea. And this is essentially where chimpanzees use long stick tools. Some of the tools measured up to 4 meters long to extract freshwater algae from the rivers and small pools. So here comes a chimp male and he's going to modify his stick to the right size. And if you pay attention to how they move their wrist when they're trying to lift up the algae, because the algae is connected to the bottom substrate. And so they have to twist the wrist in order to lift it out. So the behavior was also primarily observed during the dry season, which made sense to us because it's during the time when the weather conditions are optimal for promoting algae growth. And when we looked at all the camera trap videos from this site, we found that all age sex classes could do the behavior and ingest algae just fine. In some cases, we observed individuals sitting for 1 hour at the same location, algae fishing. So this suggests that actually a substantial amount of algae is being ingested by these chimpanzees. So at the moment, we're also looking at the nutritional profile and potential microbiome effects of this behavior. Now, when we described algae fishing, we named it something different because in comparison to another behavior that was already well known and well described from the Bosu chimpanzees that also live in Guinea. The picture here, I don't have a video, so in this picture here, you can see the chimpanzee with a tool while it's algae scooping, sorry. And the thing you'll notice is that algae scooping uses tools that are usually on average shorter than the algae fishing, and sometimes it would just require herbaceous, flexible tools, not like these long wooden sticks that I showed you in the previous video. So this behavior also was different in the fact that the chimpanzees are reported to scoop algae from the free-floating algae from the surface of the water, which makes sense, therefore, that they don't need such long sticks. But the interesting thing is that we know now that at least tools are not actually necessary to extract algae, since there's at least 2 communities of chimpanzees that use just their hands repeatedly to extract algae. And that's also the behavior that we observe in baboons, for example, and colobus monkeys when they're eating algae. So there seems to be some potential for group-specific variation in the use of tools for algae extraction, but also in the types of tools that they might use. Whether it's cultural still remains to be seen because we would need to have data on the social learning and social transmission mechanisms behind this. Now, another behavior that we found during the PanAf was something we termed accumulative stone throwing. And this caught our eye because it was the first evidence for great ape stone tool use for a non-foraging purpose. It also caught our eye because it was tied to these specific locations, namely trees, where you would observe an aggregation of stones around the base, or sometimes in the hollow of the tree as shown here in this photo. So allow me to play a video giving you an example of what the behavior looks like. Oops, sorry. Okay, I hope you could hear, I know it's pretty faint with the audio in Zoom, but I hope you could hear that, yes, the chimpanzees are making these vocalizations, the pantoot vocalizations, and then at the end when they throw the rock against the tree, it does make also a thud sound. And so for me, when I first saw this behavior, I was intrigued as to whether or not that actually the sound that the rock makes is actually potentially for a communicative purpose. And so when I went back to one of the PanAf sites in Guinea-Bissau, where they found the behavior, I was also intrigued to learn that only for the chimpanzee stone throwing sites, they only use one of 7 tree species for this behavior out of the more than 40 that we identified in the habitat. So this gave the indication that perhaps there's something special about these tree species. So together with an acoustic engineering lab in France, we designed some impact sound field experiments. And this is exactly what it looks like. I was essentially simulating chimpanzees throwing rocks at many trees using standardized rock tools like the one that's shown here. And the idea here was essentially to compare the sounds produced when you throw rocks at the tree species that the chimps use for this behavior and compare it to a set of tree species that the chimps do not use for the behavior, but are at least similar in size and morphology. And what we found was that the stone throwing tree species do actually produce sounds that are more resonant compared to a selection of non-stone throwing species. So this more resonant sound is characterized by impact sounds that have a smaller damping coefficient. So here on the y-axis is the the absolute damping coefficient. In yellow are the stone-throwing tree species in comparison to the set of non-stone-throwing species. And what you can see is that damping coefficient is smaller for the stone-throwing species, which means that the sound is damped less, and that in that sense, it lasts longer in the environment. We also found that those tree species produce sounds that had energy concentrated in the lower frequencies. So in both of these cases, this would contribute to a more resonant sound, which would be optimal for communication and sound propagation. So in general, we found results that support this communicative hypothesis. And in the very beginning, when we first described this behavior with the PanAf, we looked at the distribution of stone throwing. And what you can see here in the yellow dots are the 4 communities where we observed stone throwing to be present. And the black dots represent all the sites at the time, at least where stone throwing was absent or not reported, including all the long-term research sites where chimpanzees have been studied for decades. So this is a nice example of a behavior that we would have otherwise not have known about if it weren't, at least for the PanAf, to studying it. And at the same time, I draw your attention to the fact that the behavior is restricted to this West African region. So at the time, we also used some of our data to test whether the density of these hollow trees or the rock density might explain the distribution of the behavior. But for the 11 sites that we could actually have the data for and could test this, we didn't find support for that. And in the same vein, we don't feel there's any genetic reason why there should be any restricted gene flow within the West African region. So at the time, we also already have suggested that this behavior might be a good qualifier for a potential cultural tradition in chimpanzees, although we do still lack the social learning and social transmission data on this behavior, which hopefully I'll have something for you in the next years. But moving on to another study, a behavior where we do have very good data on the cultural transmission and social learning aspects is termite fishing. And termite fishing is a behavior where chimpanzees use sticks or herbaceous tools to extract the termite soldiers from their nests. And this was, it's kind of a very famous behavior in chimpanzees since it was first discovered by Jane Goodall in the 1960s at Gombe. And it's probably to date still the best studied tool use in cultural behavior in the wild in chimpanzees, with still some of the best data coming from Gombe on social learning, teaching, and cultural variation. Just some of the studies I've selected here for you today to illustrate that. So with the PanAf, we of course wanted to see if we could maybe learn anything new about this behavior. And we were lucky to get camera trap data on termite fishing from 10 of the communities in the PanAf. So what I'm going to do now is show you a short video describing some of the variation of what we observed. These are chimpanzees in Bafing, Mali, doing aerial termite fishing. Aerial just means that the mound is above ground. And the little chimp here already demonstrates using the forearm as a support against the mound, which is what we observed in many of the individuals in this community. Alternatively, in Gualogo, we see chimpanzees also aerial termite fishing. Here, they're going to use both hands to extract the stick, and then they wipe the stick to remove the termites for ingestion. And what was curious is that across the way, a long way from Mali in Tanzania, you see chimpanzees again also using the forearm as a support when termite fishing. The other form of termite fishing, underground termite fishing, is being demonstrated here. All chimpanzee communities that engage in this behavior use a tool set. The first tool is really thick and it's used to puncture or perforate the ground to get access to the mound. And then a thinner tool, which the chimp should pick up, is used to actually do the probing to grab the termites out of the nest. So now that it's got an entryway, it's using the smaller probe. And here in La Belgique, they use the wrist as a support. And these are chimpanzees now in Gabon. And again, you see a tool set being used. But this time the chimp will bring the stick right up to the mouth and eat directly off the stick. And in another community in Gabon, they do something entirely different. Instead of even sitting, they lie on their side and they'll bring their mouth. So they'll use just one hand to move the stick up and down, and then they'll bring their mouth to the end of the stick to eat the termites off of it. So in total, across those 10 communities, we described about 38 sort of behaviors that I just mentioned to you, are what we term technical elements involved in this termite fishing behavior. 17 were described for aerial termite fishing and 21 for underground. Of those 38, 30 of them were basically considered primarily socially driven because there was no obvious ecological constraint as to why chimpanzees should choose one over the other. And when we looked at the distribution of these technical elements across the communities, we noticed that they were significantly more similar within communities than between communities. And at the same time, we observed community-specific combinations of the elements used, which varied from either 3 to 7 technical elements. So in this graph, what you're seeing on the y-axis is something called a Sorensen similarity index, which is calculated on an individual level. And what it does is it calculates, so here it's basically comparing individuals belonging to the same community or different community, and looking to see if they vary different, if they are drastically different from one another. So these were both significantly different for both aerial fishing and for underground termite fishing, although you can see for underground termite fishing, it was much more differentiated. Similarly, we found that underground termite fishing showed greater cultural fixation relative to aerial termite fishing. And this was assessed using a cultural FST index, which is a commonly used, well, now it's more commonly used cultural index for human cultural studies. For this, we could only actually examine technical elements that sort of occur in the same group so that they occur for the same purpose. So on the x-axis, what you see are numbers, and those numbers respond to sort of different groups of technical elements. So 2 is with respect to how do they insert the stick? Is it one hand or two hands? 4 and 8 represent body positions while fishing. 6 and 11 refer to how the termites are actually ingested. So do they bring their mouth to the stick? Do they bring the stick to the mouth? Do they wipe their hand on the stick and bring the termites to the mouth? And for these, we could basically see that with respect to underground termite fishing, it was much more differentiated than for aerial termite fishing. And just to also put this more into perspective, for a cultural FST index, the values that are closer to 1 represent complete differentiation between communities. So overall, we took all these results and data as showing general support for a majority level conformity effect in termite fishing styles, at least at the community level. And we further suggested that social learning via imitation or copying of these different actions, since these technical elements really describe different actions, would be actually important to generate these community specific styles. Because in all cases, termite fishing was successful. And at least for a majority of the technical elements we considered, there's no obvious ecological constraint as to why, for example, chimpanzees should sit or rather than lie down, or use one hand over two hands, for example. Oops. So now I'm going to switch over to another study. And now we're going to talk about a little bit about threats to behavioral diversity. So this was with respect to a study published more recently or last year. And here, I want to bring your attention to, it's just in general, the fact that many of us, while we're in the field, as primatologists, witness anthropogenic threats to the environment, such as things like deforestation or logging, the acts of mining or other extractive industries, monoculture plantations, and the bushmeat and the pet trade. But for example, although we see the effects very clearly on populations and that are declining as anthropogenic and human disturbance is degrading in natural environments across Africa, at the same time, we know a lot less about how this actually affects their behavior. So there was actually a hypothesis proposed by Carl van Schaik, who was studying orangutan traditions, as many of you may know, and he termed something called the disturbance hypothesis, where he essentially predicted that socially transmitted behaviors would become at risk as human impact modifies natural habitats. And this would be not only because populations naturally might decline, but that there would also be a reduction in the resources available to these great apes, as well as social parameters suffering. So for example, there would be reduced gregariousness among individuals, smaller group sizes, and lower social cohesion. And so this would all result in a reduction in social learning opportunities, which would then, you would expect, would suggest that in areas with high human impact, you should have lower behavioral and cultural diversity. So to set out and test the disturbance hypothesis, I co-led a study where we basically took the PanAf video data from about 46 communities, and we supplemented this from the published literature, since chimpanzees have been studied for decades, and we could find data on 106 additional communities. In total, this represented 144 unique communities, where we could code basically evidence, direct or indirect, for 31 different behaviors. And we used those 31 different behaviors as a proxy for chimpanzee behavioral diversity. Oh, and sorry, I should mention that direct evidence included anything that researchers had observed in the field or had been recorded on camera traps, and indirect evidence included anything like discarded tools being left behind or finding feeding remains in the dung, for example. I'm not going to give you a long list of 31 behaviors, but this is just to give you a nice little overview. You'll notice that many of the behaviors were involving tools. And essentially what we included in here were behaviors that had already been deemed cultural, like the termite fishing, for example, or had shown some degree of social learning or social transmission. And then we also included behaviors that show some degree of population variation, like the algae fishing and the cumulative stone throwing. And what we did at the same time was we categorized the behaviors. So for example, oh, now I messed up my slide. So we categorized the behaviors into 13 different categories. I'll just, they're going to come up here now. So the categories were foraging, communication, thermoregulation, water extraction, and ground protection. And the majority of the behaviors are for foraging. So we further defined those categories based on the particular resource targeted. And so in total, that was 13 categories. And we use this essentially as an additional response variable that we could use to check our results and basically use kind of a more conservative measure of behavioral diversity. To quantify human disturbance, we used a freely available human footprint GIS layer. And this is a layer that calculates the influence of human activity on the Earth's land surface. It takes into account things like human population density, access to within 15 kilometers to a major road, river, or coastline, as well as infrastructure and land use changes such as like agriculture and development. And the nice thing about it is that it has a very high resolution. So we could take the value essentially at the core of each chimpanzee community to assign a specific human footprint value. So what did we find? Well, we found support for Carl van Schaik's hypothesis in that behavioral diversity is indeed lower in areas where there's higher human impact. I'm going to show you basically the plot of the results from a Bayesian regression analysis. On the y-axis will be the probability of occurrence across all 31 behaviors. And on the x-axis will be the human footprint value for a single community. And what you see is that, yes, in areas where there's a higher human footprint, meaning communities that have experienced greater anthropogenic disturbance, there was a lower probability of those 31 behaviors being present. So here, the dashed line is the model line. It controls for observation effort per community, the subspecies, and spatial autocorrelation among communities. And the graded colors around the model line represent the 97, 87, and 67% credibility interval. And the circles represent the number of communities for that given combination of the response and the predictor. And we found very similar effect if we looked at just the behavioral categories. So we took our results essentially as evidence that cultural diversity is also negatively affected by human impact in chimpanzees, considering that the majority of the behaviors we included had already previous evidence as being cultural in previous research. And of course, cultural traits are actually been already shown to be important for many species, such as elephants and cetaceans. And it was, in fact, cetacean researchers who already coined the term culturally significant units as a term to help guide conservation efforts for wild cetaceans. And when it comes to chimpanzees, though, we might need to be a little bit more careful about what we consider when we think about anthropogenic disturbance, since it might act sort of as like a double-edged sword. I like to think about it, because although we can see from our results that human disturbance is threatening the existence of cultural traditions, at the same time, under some special conditions, it could actually help to promote new ones. So for example, you might get new behavioral innovations in areas where chimpanzees are still thriving, but environments have already been morphed or have already been changed due to human impact and human activities. And in those cases, those behavioral innovations would feed back onto the cultural traditions established in these communities and change them over time. So essentially, the effect of anthropogenic disturbance might need to be considered as something that's more dynamic and really potentially changing over time. So that brings me to the end of my talk. I hope I was able to keep you interested for those 30 or so minutes. And what I'd like to do is also just bring your attention to a few studies that will hopefully be published in the next months or two. So if you're interested in any of these further, you can see some of the titles here. Follow me on Twitter or keep in touch with our Pan-African website for the publications. And with that, I'd just like to show you my long list of acknowledgements, because I can't say all of them out loud, but there's a lot of people to thank that make the PanAf possible, as well as my own research on cumulative stone throwing. And I would also like to thank you for listening to me today.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Ammie. That was amazing. I remember the first batch of PanAf volunteers shuffling into the building in Leipzig, and then the what came out of it in the end. It's absolutely breathtaking, in terms of the size and the amount of data. And I mean, you'll never stop publishing about this. This is an insane data set, and so many angles to take there. We do have a couple of questions already, and maybe I'll start off with one. And it's about how to start kind of a successful citizen scientist project, because I think the chimpanzee for primatology, as far as I know, is the only project that makes real use of citizen scientists, and you seem to have a very engaged crowd of people. How do you keep this going? Like, how do you get a project off the ground like this?
Okay, well, I can say that the success of Chimpanzee is really all due to Mimi Arangelovich, who runs the project on our side. And I mean, without her dedication to the Chimpanzee, it wouldn't be possible that it would still be functioning. But of course, I also have to give credit to the Zooniverse team. So Zooniverse, some people might be more familiar with like Snapshot Serengeti is a very famous project, and that uses camera trap photos. Ours, if I understand correctly, the very first camera trap project with videos. So we gave Zooniverse kind of a whole new challenge when we came to them and asked, okay, like we want to set up this citizen science project. And they have been really supportive from the very beginning. So Zooniverse is a well-established leader in citizen science projects. And so they were it may make sense to go to someone and partner with a group like that who already know exactly what they're doing. Especially they were so flexible with us because we were using a data set that they were completely new to with using video format, which they're incredibly open to and were flexible. So yeah, I think basically I can just recommend talking to Zooniverse first. And I do know that there are multiple, like even smaller projects. So ours is maybe considered a very large project since we have so much data, but there are some at least field projects I know of where they just have a very finite set of videos and they run the project for a very short time on the Zooniverse platform. So you can find a whole variation in the types of projects that they have there. So I would start off by first looking there and then see if you want to contact them for what you're doing.
Fantastic. Susanna's asking, given what, like just the spread of the PanAf in so many different countries, how did you involve the local communities. You know, this
Yeah.
has such a potential for involving people, educating them about chimpanzees, for development. Like how was this done?
So I think one of the best things that we did was the fact that we always went to NGOs that were already established in the regions where we wanted to go. And then we would contact them first. So only with local NGO support did we then, you know, go in and have actually access to a site or be able to set up a site with their support. And then that really helped to explain things to the local community and make them understand why we were there in the first place. And that was really done, you know, with these basically village-based meetings and NGO hosted events to basically explain the purpose and what can be done and what we were there for. And on top of it, all of our local teams, basically our field teams, were usually hiring local people. So not just as for you know, day jobs and things like that, but also as local field assistants. So in that sense, they were out with us in the field for 1 or 2 years, learning the ins and outs of the field protocol. And in that sense, we hopefully contributed to some capacity building in these countries.
Fantastic. And what's next for the PanAf? Like, how is this going to develop now? Because things are changing in Leipzig.
Yeah,
you know,
that's true.
what's the long-term plan of this database, which it is now essentially?
To be honest, I don't know because I'm not one of the directors, but I know that for me, at least, I plan on hopefully continuing to work and publish with this data set, even as I go into my new job in Canada, and supporting, you know, things like Chimpanzee and the other initiatives that are being done. And at the moment, there is a lot of sort of methods development being done with the PanAf, which would then also ease and make the data processing go much faster. So there is actually still a lot of data that needs to be essentially put into a format that can be easily analyzed. And so, for example, all the dietary stuff, we have loads of organic samples that are currently being analyzed, but this is, you know, the first time they're being analyzed. And so there's a lot of data that's still going to be coming out of this project. And at the same time, there's multiple collaborators that work across the world that are using different parts of this data set. And so, yeah, I don't see any slowing down of this project anytime soon.
One question by Megan Fitzgerald addresses whether you recorded and analyzed other acoustic parameters in the accumulative stone throwing experiments. So
sure. Yeah, we didn't. So the only thing I included for the impact sound experiment was really just, we only analyzed the impact sound. So the sound that the rock makes when it hits the tree. And that was done by my collaborators who basically are experts in material sound properties. So because it's not a vocalization, it's it's really like one material hitting another material. And then we had basically they were all essentially parameters that describe the timbre of that sound. So that it's very, it's basically just like, for example, the best way to describe it would be when you hit like a xylophone, for example, a xylophone made of different materials, it would always sound differently no matter what, because the materials have their own intrinsic properties, just as these different tree species have their own intrinsic sound properties. The other thing I would like to do is to analyze the acoustic parameters of the vocalizations that accompany this behavior. So like you could hear, hopefully, the pantoot vocalization that accompanies the behavior, and that is something that I could do, which would be quite fun for me, is actually to analyze the vocalizations. And for example, to look at variation compared to when they use the rock throwing as opposed to when they don't. And if there's perhaps variation along those lines.
And do these stone throwing events leave like an archaeological record?
Oh,
like
yes.
on the trees, first of all, and then also the rocks themselves?
Yeah, I think I didn't show it, but on the trees themselves, you can really, when you're there, you can really see that this tree has been used for this behavior, because you get repeated marks on the tree. I could even show you maybe, because then if you have more time, you can look at it. But so on this tree, for example, if you look at this, if you can see it clearly enough, there are thousands of impact wound marks on this tree. And if you were to look on the other side of this tree, you would not see any of those. So the chimps are really using this one side repeatedly, and you can observe that these wound marks are happening. Especially when you can also observe when there's a fresh wound mark, because it looks different from the ones that are older, that have been already repaired by the tree. And so from a visual perspective, there's definitely like, a visual signal that's left behind, including also the accumulation of rocks. But on an archaeological perspective, we're thinking about looking at this with like Lydia, for example, to see if there's some kind of archaeological signal when it comes to the concentration of the stones. But for the moment, it's mostly, for me, the most dramatic aspect as far as creating a signal in the landscape is really the trees themselves that become really battered by this behavior.
That is amazing. Moving on to the new termite fishing study, Alejandra is asking whether there are differences in termite prey and termite species that might explain some of the variations you see, for example, in whether they kind of clean the ants off or the termites off first before they eat them, or they eat them directly from the stick, and things like that. Did you control for differences in the termites essentially?
We didn't. We unfortunately didn't have the data to control for, because we didn't have the exact prey species eaten at each of the mounds where we have the camera traps. But all the species, if I understand, were mostly this macrotermes. And so at least for one of the fishing they were of the genus macrotermes. We know that there's loads of species of that genus. And so there was a study that was well done by the Guologo team with Cricket Sands and David Morgan, and they did a more really well done study where they looked at the prey species, especially in like a small area, essentially in Congo and whatnot. And they could already see that even this variation and the slight variation in the prey species couldn't account for these smaller differences that they had already recorded with the Guologo chimpanzees. So we doubt that this would make a difference, since already has been shown not to, at least for some of the technical elements. Definitely for some of the more technical elements, like perhaps the removing of the stick quickly or something like this, because the different prey species might have different speeds, which has been shown for ant dipping, for example. That could play a factor, but at least for the majority of the technical elements, it didn't seem to play a huge role.
And then along the same veins, again by Alejandra, you suggest in the study that some of these termite fishing techniques are cumulative and might be evidence for cumulative culture. And she's asking, given that you don't know what these techniques looked like in the past, what evidence you base this on?
Yeah, exactly. So it's that should also be a line in the paper that says that because we don't have longitudinal data or ontogenetic data, we can't say which elements came first or which elements came later. And that would be what's required. Basically, this historical longitudinal data set would be required to be able to follow the progress of the technical elements over time. And so that's why it's not a major feature, and it's just a speculative sentence in the discussion. But essentially, the idea behind wanting to discuss this cumulative culture is the fact that we see this combination difference. So the fact that you have like a set of technical elements that you would see different combinations in different communities might allude to the fact that there has been a different historical process over time in the different communities as to which elements get accumulated in one group compared to another. And that's where that idea comes from.
Fantastic. I'll ask two more quick questions and then I'll let you go. First one is by Lucy, asking of all of the possible future research projects that could come out of this, what would you think is the most exciting one? Because there's obviously an endless amount of information in this. Like, what would you love to see happening with this?
I mean, okay, so one of the things that we are going to do, or at least it's on the docket, is looking at for each community, it's behavioral repertoire, and looking at the genetic signal that we have from also the PanAf data set. So we can only do this really with the PanAf sites where we have both behavior and genetics. But this would be an unprecedented like scale because we would have so many communities at least that we could include, and to essentially look to see if there is not only like ecological but also genetic drivers for the variation in behaviors and cultural behaviors that we already know of driving that variation or not, because this is still one of those outstanding questions. Although many people are kind of okay now saying that chimps have culture, at the same time, the mechanisms behind it are still highly debated, whether it's, you know, more ecologically focused or whether it's really genetically determined. So this would be one of the things that for sure we need to do with the PanAf and is on our to-do list. And I'm looking forward to that. And otherwise for me, it's also about learning more about these behaviors that we discovered and trying to understand better the variation that drives why they occur in some places and not in others. So looking more at the ecological factors and ecological variation for the algae fishing, as well as other factors that might influence why certain communities stone throw and others don't.
Fantastic. And then maybe as a last question is by Dan asking whether we can use, and in a vein of what you mentioned earlier, if we can use this time depth perspective that we now get from the PanAf, less so because it's very short term in a way, it's a year, but also from some of the long-term sides, if we have really 30, 40 years of video material, do you think we can get towards this idea of cumulative culture that way? Like that we, you know, start early on with the first Gombe records and we see how things change slowly over time.
I think that's like exactly what we should do because as you mentioned, there's like a lot of long-term records that also have like other media such as video recordings. I think Bosu also has a really rich video data set. And so those things that can be examined over time would be perfect for looking at these kinds of things. And like I said, with the PanAf, because we have that 1 or 2 year window, we can't get into the social learning mechanism or ontogenetic or developmental mechanisms behind some of these behaviors. And that's why we have to keep going back. So like now I've started going back to some of the sites. And that's the idea, is to create this record that spans, you know, at least 10 or 20 years, that then you could look to see what's actually happening and what's changing or what's being learned or what's being dropped. And that's when we could really try to get at some of these cumulative cultural questions. I think to date, we just don't have, we never had the data really to look at it before this, but now we can really do that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Ammie. That was a pleasure.
Thank you.
If anyone has further questions, feel free to contact Ammie directly.
You can email me or whatever on Twitter or whatever.
And then, as Ammie was saying in the beginning, this was our last virtual primate conversation before the summer, and we will be starting again in September or October. So watch this space, and I hope you all have a fantastic summer. Thank you again to Ammie, and goodbye.